Hey guys, tonight I want you to lean back, dim the lights. Maybe even let that soft hum of a fan or the creak of your house join us in the background. Because we're about to step into a world that feels both familiar and impossibly distant. We're going to talk about love in the Middle Ages. But not just the kind of love you read in poems or see painted on church walls. We're talking about the real, messy, awkward, and often political world of dating, desire, and marriage when knights clanked in armor, peasants smelled of hay, and romance had to wrestle with the weight of cows, coins, and family honor. Now think about it. Today you might swipe left or right, send a late-night text that says, "What are you doing?" Or maybe drop a heart emoji under a picture. But if you were alive in medieval Europe, your romantic fate wasn't a matter of preference. It was a matter of survival, land, and livestock. Your dating app wasn't your phone. It was your father, your priest, or sometimes even your king, negotiating your future with a handshake and a ledger. Imagine being 15 years old and already promised to someone you've never spoken more than 2 words to. Picture standing in a cold stone chapel, the smell of damp straw mixing with incense, looking at a stranger who is about to be your spouse. You might think your heart would be pounding with butterflies. More often than not, it was pounding with nerves, calculation, and the quiet resignation that your life had been decided long before you even had the chance to dream. That's the first big difference. In the medieval world, marriage wasn't the sweet culmination of love. It was the scaffolding that held society together. Families forged alliances through weddings. Land and titles passed through vows. And love, if it showed up at all, was expected to squeeze itself in afterward, like an uninvited guest at a banquet. But don't think medieval people didn't feel passion. They absolutely did. They wrote poems, sang songs, scribbled verses on scraps of parchment, and sighed under moonlight. The trouble was, acting on those passions could get you in serious trouble. Falling in love before marriage, that was dangerous. Falling in love outside marriage, that could be scandalous, even deadly. So how did people express their feelings? Well, sometimes it was with little tokens. A ribbon tucked into a sleeve, a carved wooden spoon left at someone's door, a secret glance at the village well. Other times, it was through what we now call courtly love, a strange, dramatic ritual where knights poured out their souls for noble ladies they could never have. It was less about getting the girl and more about proving how deeply and beautifully you could suffer in her honor. Think about that for a second. Today, someone might show they care by bringing you coffee or texting, made at home safe. Back then, a knight would wear his lady's colors into a joust, write tortured poetry about her silver laugh or her sunlit hair, and then spend months pining away without ever actually touching her hand. Romantic, maybe. Frustrating, absolutely. But it wasn't just the nobles who had complicated rules. Peasants too had to navigate the tangled world of marriage negotiations. Picture this. Your parents know the neighbor's daughter has a strong pair of hands and her family owns a goat that produces twice as much milk as anyone else's. Suddenly, you're courting. Not because you've exchanged stolen kisses in the hayloft, but because that goat is a solid investment. Still, among all the cows, coins, and contracts, little sparks of real human affection did flicker. We know this because people risked everything to follow their hearts. There are stories of couples who ran away from arranged matches, of forbidden romances whispered about for generations, of troubadours who sang of lovers bold enough to defy their families. And in those moments, we see something timeless, the stubborn insistence of the human heart. Let's pause here. Close your eyes and imagine walking through a medieval village. The dirt road is uneven under your shoes. Smoke curls from thatched roofs. You pass the blacksmith's forge, where sparks fly like fireflies and a group of children chasing a chicken across the mud. You see a young man glance at the miller's daughter. His face flushes. She lowers her eyes, but not before a smile slips across her lips. No words, no touch, just that glance. In a world of arranged futures, sometimes that was all the dating you got. And yet it mattered. That glance might become a song sung quietly while hauling water. It might be remembered for years, even if nothing ever came of it. Because humans have always longed for connection, even in societies where love wasn't the main currency. Now let's step into the castle walls. If you were noble, your romantic future was decided by treaties and maps. You weren't just a person. You were a walking treaty, a flesh and blood alliance sealed with a kiss you may not have wanted to give. Daughters were married off to secure borders. Sons were pledged to secure inheritances. To be blunt, love was political strategy. Your wedding was less about butterflies in the stomach and more about irrigation rights and armies. But here's where it gets interesting. Because even within those cold transactions, people dreamed. A princess might dream of the troubadour singing below her balcony. A knight might dream of the lady whose veil he carried in battle. And sometimes, against all odds, real love did manage to grow inside those arranged marriages. Letters survive of noble couples who grew fond of each other, who wrote of companionship, humor, and even tenderness. So when we talk about dating in the Middle Ages, we're really talking about layers. The surface layer was survival, land, livestock, alliances, but beneath that was the pulsing, unpredictable heart. The rules said marriage first, love maybe later, but the heart didn't always listen. Think of it this way: in our world, we date to see if love can lead to marriage. In theirs, they married to see if marriage could lead to love. And in that reversal, entire lives were shaped, sometimes into stories of loyalty and devotion, other times into tragedies sung by poets for centuries. And so, tonight, as we peel back the layers of medieval romance, I want you to picture the quiet strength it must have taken to live in a world where your feelings had to fit into contracts, where desire had to hide in glances, where love was a secret rebellion even when it lived inside the walls of a marriage. This was dating in the Middle Ages, awkward, strategic, poetic, and deeply human. And as we wander deeper into this world, you'll see just how much it shaped not only private lives but the course of kingdoms. Now let's slip deeper into that world we left behind, the one of flickering torches, stone walls damp with centuries of prayers, and hearts that beat just as wildly as ours do today. If part one showed us the scaffolding, the arranged matches, the alliances, the contracts, then part two is going to pull back the veil on how people actually flirted, courted, and dared to chase desire in the cracks of that system. Because yes, medieval people did date, though not in the way you're imagining with candlelit dinners or movie nights. Dating was a dance, a performance, and sometimes a dangerous game. Picture a feast inside a great hall. Long wooden tables covered in trenchers of bread, platters of roasted boar, and pitchers of ale. Minstrels strum lutes, their voices weaving through the chatter of knights and ladies. Somewhere near the hearth, two young nobles exchange a glance across the table. He fiddles with the hilt of his dagger. She lowers her eyes demurely, but the spark is undeniable. How do they act on it? They can't just stand up and declare, "I like you." That would risk gossip, scandal, maybe even ruin. So instead, they use coded gestures, a dropped glove, a ribbon tied around a wrist, a dance where fingertips brush just a second longer than proper. These were signals, the emojis of their time. Entire romances lived and died in the space of a shared look during a carol or a whispered word during a May Day festival. And let's talk about festivals, because if there was ever a chance to bend the rules, it was then. Picture spring bursting across the countryside, fields greening, flowers pushing through frost. Villages would erupt in May Day celebrations, bonfires, dances around the maypole, songs that mixed piety with earthy humor. In those liminal hours, when drink flowed and laughter drowned out the stern watch of elders, young men and women sometimes stole away into the fields. It wasn't called dating, but it was the closest thing to freedom they got. For some, it was just fun. For others, it led to hurried promises, secret vows, or trouble 9 months later. Now you might be wondering, what about love letters? Did medieval people really sit down and pour out their hearts with ink and parchment? Absolutely. And these weren't simple "I like you" notes. They were elaborate, poetic, dripping with metaphor. A knight might describe his lady's eyes as stars guiding him through the battlefield, or her presence as a cure stronger than any herb. But here's the twist. These letters often had to be smuggled. A trusted servant, a sympathetic priest, or even a bribed gatekeeper might deliver them. Getting caught could mean shame, punishment, or worse. Yet people risked it anyway. Because at the core, humans haven't changed. The thrill of sneaking a message, the flutter when a reply comes. It's the same heartbeat people feel when a phone buzzes with a text today. The technology is different, but the hunger for connection is eternal. Now, let's zoom out for a moment. Not every romance was forbidden. In villages where people lived cheek by jowl, marriages often came from familiarity. You grew up with someone, shared chores, attended the same church, and one day your families agreed it made sense. But even here, sparks mattered. Folk songs from the period tell of love blooming during harvests, of girls teased at the well by boys carrying buckets, of laughter exchanged while stomping grapes. These were the everyday romances, small but meaningful, woven into the rhythm of survival. And yet always the rules pressed in. The church loomed large over love. It dictated who you could marry, when you could marry, even how you could show affection. Kissing in public, too bold. Intimacy before marriage, a sin. Divorcing a spouse, nearly impossible. Priests preached that marriage was sacred, unbreakable, and meant for children. Passion was something to be restrained, redirected, or wrapped in ritual. But what happens when passion refuses to be restrained? That's when we get the stories that still captivate us today. Think of Tristan and Isolde, whose doomed love defied duty and poisoned them with longing. Think of Abelard and Héloïse, whose letters still burn with passion centuries later, even though their love brought tragedy. These weren't just tales. They reflected real tensions between heart and duty, between desire and obedience. And here's the thing. Sometimes, those tensions exploded. A young woman promised to a wealthy older man might run away with her true love. A knight sworn to loyalty might betray his oath for a lady's smile. And while society condemned them, the storytellers immortalized them. Because deep down, people admired the courage it took to put love above everything else. Now let's take a step into the psychology of it. Imagine being a young man in medieval Europe. You know your worth isn't measured by how charming you are or how funny your jokes land. It's measured in acres, animals, and armor. And imagine being a young woman. Your beauty might be praised, your dowry negotiated, but your voice is often hushed. Yet within those limits, both found ways to assert themselves. A girl might delay a marriage by feigning illness. A boy might write a ballad so moving it wins a lady's sympathy. Tiny acts of rebellion that whispered, "I am more than my duty." And let's not forget the darker side, because with power imbalances came exploitation. Lords could demand what peasants couldn't refuse. Women bore the risks of pregnancies that could upend their futures. Love could be dangerous, not just emotionally, but physically, socially, spiritually. That's why so many medieval stories frame love as both divine blessing and perilous fire. It could sanctify, it could destroy. But here's where I want you to pause and think. Doesn't that sound a lot like today? We think we're modern with apps, texts, and endless choice. Yet the same themes repeat. Love as rebellion, love as transaction, love as longing and risk. The details change, the heartbeat does not. So if you ever catch yourself scrolling late at night wondering why love feels complicated, remember, it's always been complicated. The peasants, the knights, the nobles, they all wrestled with the same messy truth. That love is both a cage and a freedom, a duty and a dream. And as we keep walking through this medieval landscape together, I'll show you more. The scandals, the serenades, the heartbreaks that shaped not just lives but entire kingdoms. Because in the Middle Ages, who you loved, or who you didn't, could change the fate of dynasties. If the last part showed us the glow of festivals and the whispered secrets of love letters, now we're going to step into the quieter, more personal side of medieval dating. The places where love was tested not in poetry or in song, but in the grit of daily life. Imagine walking into a medieval village at dawn. The air is cold, your breath fogging in front of you. Chickens scratch the dirt, smoke curls from low-roofed cottages, and the clatter of buckets tells you someone's already at the well. This well wasn't just for water. It was a social hub, a meeting point where eyes met and hands brushed. A boy might offer to carry a heavy bucket for a girl. She might refuse or let him. And in that simple act, everyone watching knew a spark had been lit. These tiny interactions mattered, because in a world where marriages were often decided by families or lords, the moments where two people could actually choose each other were rare. A smile at the well, a stolen word while bringing sheep to pasture, a shared laugh at market. These were the building blocks of something deeper. And let's not forget the church door. After Sunday Mass, villages came alive with chatter. Men lingered, women pretended to busy themselves, and the elders watched like hawks. Courtship wasn't hidden. It unfolded under the eyes of the community. To show interest was to step into a stage where everyone had an opinion. A careless gesture could spark gossip that outlived the romance itself. But still, people risked it, because where else could you find love? Now, let's move to the castles where nobles played a very different game. If peasants flirted with glances and chores, nobles courted with spectacle. Picture a knight entering a tournament. He lowers his lance not just to win glory, but to win her favor, the lady sitting high in the stands. Before the joust, he ties her ribbon to his arm, a declaration that every strike, every blow he takes is for her. Imagine the thrill she feels knowing her presence fuels his courage. But here's the twist. It wasn't always love. Sometimes it was strategy. That ribbon might belong to a woman he barely knew, but wearing it forged alliances, cemented loyalties, built networks of power. Dating and politics were braided so tightly together you could hardly tell them apart. Behind every fluttering veil, behind every shining shield, there were calculations being made. Who gained? Who lost? Who would climb higher if two hands joined in marriage? And yet, love still slipped through the cracks. Some knights truly fought for the woman who captured their heart. Some ladies truly gave their token to the one they loved, not the one they were told to favor. These moments of defiance fueled legends. Troubadours turned them into ballads sung across Europe, and centuries later we still tell those stories. But dating wasn't just noble games or peasant chores. It was also trial and error, literally. In certain towns, young men and women were paired in curious customs. Some villages held festivals where lots were drawn, matching couples for the evening or even for the year. Sometimes these pairings turned into marriages. Other times they ended in awkward silence. Imagine the mix of excitement and dread, like a medieval version of speed dating, except your neighbors were all watching. And then there were the rituals steeped in superstition. Girls would pluck petals from daisies. He loves me not. They'd slip pins into their sleeves before bed, hoping to dream of their future husband. They'd stare into mirrors by candlelight on certain nights, believing a vision of their lover would appear. These weren't just games. They were desperate attempts to wrestle a little control in a world where so much was decided for them. Let's not gloss over the fact that for many, dating wasn't sweet, it was survival. For a poor farmer's daughter, catching the eye of a man with a cow or an extra plot of land could mean the difference between hunger and security. For a younger son with no inheritance, marrying a woman with a small dowry could mean stepping out of his older brother's shadow. Attraction mattered, yes, but survival was always in the background, whispering in their choices. And yet, listen to the songs, the poems, the gossip recorded in letters and chronicles, and you realize that love mattered too. People wanted to fall in love. They wanted butterflies. They wanted that racing heartbeat when someone touched their hand. You can hear it in the way they wrote, the way they sang, the way they risked everything for one stolen kiss. Think about this. Have you ever sat across from someone pretending not to care, while every fiber of your body screamed otherwise? That's exactly what young lovers did under the stern eyes of their parents or the sharp gaze of a priest. They lived their whole romance in fragments, in stolen moments, in coded language, in the space between duty and desire. And sometimes those fragments turned into flames. Lovers would elope, vanishing into forests or fleeing to another town, chasing freedom no matter the cost. Some were dragged back, punished, humiliated. Others made it, carving out new lives together, remembered in hushed whispers as daring souls. These were the medieval runaways, the rebels who proved that even in a rigid world, love could still bend the rules. So when we talk about dating in the Middle Ages, don't think of it as something quaint or distant. Think of it as human. Messy, complicated, thrilling, and terrifying. The setting changes. Stone walls instead of coffee shops, tournaments instead of text messages. But the pulse is the same. Two people trying to find each other in a world that often stands in their way. And as we keep going, I'll take you even deeper. We'll look at how religion tried to steer love, how families schemed, how desire slipped into poetry and scandal alike. Because the story of dating in medieval times isn't just about who married who. It's about how humans fought, quietly, desperately, for connection in a world that told them to obey. Now, if you thought love in medieval times was all about festivals, secret glances, and knights jousting with ribbons, Let's add another layer, the church. Because in the Middle Ages, the church wasn't just the guardian of souls. It was the referee of love. Imagine this. You're in a small stone chapel, candles flickering, incense hanging in the air. The priest preaches not only about salvation, but also about who you can or cannot love. Marriage wasn't just personal, it was a sacrament, a sacred bond in the eyes of God. And because of that, the church held incredible power. Dating, as we think of it, that was tricky. The church discouraged casual romance, suspicious of passion that seemed too fiery. They preferred unions arranged with clear dowries and family alliances. But people are people. They still found ways. They whispered during processions, passed notes hidden in prayer books, slipped promises in the quiet of cloisters. And here's where it gets fascinating. The church didn't just dictate rules, it created loopholes. Ever heard of bans of marriage? This was a public announcement, read 3 Sundays in a row, declaring that 2 people intended to wed. Anyone who knew a reason they shouldn't could step forward. But if lovers could keep their relationship quiet until those bans were read, they might outmaneuver disapproving families. Still, the church was strict. Forbidden degrees of kinship meant you couldn't marry someone too closely related. And in small villages, that was complicated. Everybody was related to everybody, at least a little. Imagine falling for someone only to have the priest declare, "No, you're 4th cousins. That's too close." Hearts broke not from betrayal, but from canon law. But here's the thing, not everyone listened. Some defied the church. Secret marriages happened. Priests were bribed. Lovers took oaths under the moon instead of beneath a crucifix. And when these secrets came out, oh, the scandals. Entire families torn apart, reputations ruined. In a society where honor meant survival, a whispered affair could be more dangerous than a sword fight. Take the case of noble courts. Behind those stone walls, things weren't always holy. Affairs between knights and married ladies happened, enough to inspire centuries of poetry. Troubadours sang of forbidden love, of passion that ignored duty. The famous story of Lancelot and Guinevere wasn't just legend. It reflected a reality nobles both feared and secretly envied. Because who didn't want love that defied rules? But love had consequences. A woman caught in an affair might be sent to a convent for life, stripped of her family, her children taken from her. A man might face exile or even death, and yet they still risked it. Why? Because desire doesn't vanish just because someone writes a rule. Let's zoom out. Families, especially noble ones, treated marriage like chess. Every move was about land, alliances, and power. Picture a father negotiating his daughter's future like a contract. Dowries weren't just gifts, they were economic strategies. If she married well, the family rose. If she didn't, they sank. Can you imagine being told that your worth was measured in acres or silver coins? That the person you loved didn't matter, only the land they came with. And yet, even in this cold system, human hearts rebelled. Chronicles tell of young nobles sneaking away to meet shepherds or squires, of daughters refusing to marry the suitor chosen for them, even under threat of disinheritance. Some were crushed, forced into obedience. Others sparked legendary dramas, tales retold for centuries. It wasn't just nobles. Among commoners, love still clashed with law. Say you were a young farmer's son who loved the miller's daughter. Her father might demand a dowry you could never afford. You'd stand outside her cottage at night, heartbreaking, knowing she would be given to someone richer. The ache of class divisions wasn't just political, it was deeply personal. Now, let's touch on the darker side. What about those who broke the rules not out of love, but lust? Adultery was punished harshly, but it happened constantly. And the punishments themselves tell us a lot. In some towns, adulterers were paraded through the streets half-dressed, mocked by crowds. In others, they were forced to perform humiliating penance, kneeling at the church door, confessing their sins for all to hear. But here's a paradox. The same society that punished adultery also celebrated tales of forbidden passion in songs and stories. The tension between rules and desire was everywhere, woven into the fabric of medieval life. On one hand, strict laws and sermons. On the other, secret poems, coded glances, and the thrill of risk. So let me ask you this. Have you ever wanted something so badly you risked everything for it, even though you knew the world would judge you? That's what medieval lovers lived with daily. Every glance could spark gossip. Every word could shift your fate. Love wasn't just romance. It was rebellion, survival, and sometimes tragedy. And this is why dating in medieval times fascinates us today. Because beneath all the rules, the power plays, the sermons, there were still people, longing, dreaming, risking. And that tension between control and freedom made every romance feel like destiny hanging by a thread. As we continue, we'll step deeper into the courts of kings and queens, where love could spark wars, where a kiss could alter history. Because in the medieval world, romance wasn't just personal, it was political. And sometimes, the fate of nations rested on who dared to love whom. Now let's walk past the village chapel, through the crowded marketplace, and into the marble halls of medieval courts. If love in the fields was risky, love at the top was downright dangerous. Because here, every kiss, every whispered promise wasn't just gossip, it was politics. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine. She wasn't just a queen. She was a force of nature. Married first to the King of France, then to the King of England, she knew how love and marriage could redraw maps. Her dowry wasn't a chest of gold, it was half of southern France. Imagine that. One woman's hand in marriage carried entire regions. Kings fought not only for her beauty, but for her land. But Eleanor wasn't content to sit quietly. She led crusades, plotted rebellions, and raised children who became kings and queens themselves. In her story, love and power were so tangled you couldn't pull them apart. And she wasn't alone. Think about Henry Roman 8 centuries later. His obsession with love, lust, and heirs changed the entire religious landscape of England. But long before him, medieval monarchs were already proving that who you loved could shake empires. Here's the thing. Royal marriages weren't really about romance. They were contracts, written in Latin, sealed with wax, and blessed by bishops. A young princess might leave her home at 12 or 13, traveling hundreds of miles to marry a prince she'd never met. The hope that she'd bring peace between kingdoms, the fear that her womb would be the battlefield if she didn't produce an heir. But did that mean love didn't exist in those gilded halls? Not at all. It just meant love often had to bloom in the shadows. Picture a courtly banquet, tapestries on the walls, torches blazing, musicians strumming lutes. The king sits on his throne, the queen by his side. But in the corners, behind columns, among courtiers, eyes meet, smiles are exchanged, hands brush under the table. Love in the court was a dance of secrets, and sometimes those secrets exploded. Consider the scandal of Abelard and Heloise. He was a brilliant scholar, she his student. Their passion defied church and society alike. When her family found out, the punishment was brutal. And yet their letters, written after they were torn apart, still echo with longing centuries later. That's the thing about medieval love. It refused to be silenced. Then there's the legend of Tristan and Isolde. Was it myth? Was it based on real lovers? Either way, the story gripped the medieval imagination. A knight and a princess, bound by duty to others but consumed by a love potion that doomed them both. People across Europe whispered their names, sang their story because it mirrored something true. Sometimes love felt fated, irresistible even when it led to ruin. Now let's talk about tournaments. You've seen them in movies, knights in armor, lances shattering, crowds cheering. But did you know these jousts were also stages for romance? A knight would wear a lady's colors, a token tied to his arm proving his devotion. Winning wasn't just about glory, it was about earning her favor. Sometimes the lady was his wife, sometimes she wasn't. The symbolism was powerful, but the risk was real. One wrong choice of token, one secret too public, and reputations burned. And yet, the idea of courtly love grew from this very tension. This wasn't marriage love. It was idealized, poetic, often unattainable. A knight serving his lady with loyalty, even if he could never truly have her. Troubadours sang it, poets penned it, entire courts embraced it. In some ways, it was safer to long for love that couldn't be fulfilled. It was a love no law could punish because it lived in verse and song. But sometimes, art spilled into life. A queen admired too openly, a knight too daring, and suddenly rumors spread. And in the medieval world, rumors killed. A single whisper of impropriety could justify exile, annulment, even execution. Still, let's not forget the human side. Behind all the banners, treaties, and battles, there were real hearts beating. Imagine being a young princess promised to a king decades older, sent away from everyone you knew. The loneliness, the fear, and then, perhaps, a kind glance from a knight at court, someone who saw you not as a pawn but as a person. Would you risk everything for that feeling? Many did, and history remembers them as sinners or legends, depending on who wrote the story. Here's a question. Do we really think people back then were so different from us? Strip away the crowns and castles, and what do you see? Desire, ambition, fear of rejection, the hope of connection, the pain of loss, the thrill of love that feels forbidden. That's why medieval love stories still move us, because they remind us that across centuries, hearts beat the same. So as we leave the royal courts and their dangerous romances, we step into another world of love, the villages, the towns, the fairs, where ordinary people built lives together without crowns, but with struggles just as fierce. Because if love at the top could start wars, love at the bottom could start revolutions of its own. Step out of the castle gates and walk into the fields, and you'll find another world entirely. Out here, love didn't come with treaties or dowries of entire provinces. It came with a glance across the market stall, a shared loaf of bread, or a stolen moment at the edge of the harvest fields. For peasants and townsfolk, marriage was less about politics and more about survival. You weren't thinking of uniting kingdoms, you were thinking of whether your family could make it through winter. But that didn't mean romance was absent. In fact, it was everywhere, tucked into the rhythms of everyday life. Picture a summer festival, the air buzzing with fiddles and flutes, the smell of roasting meat drifting over the crowd, boys and girls lined up for circle dances, hands brushing, cheeks flushing. For many, this was the best chance to meet someone beyond their tiny hamlet. And make no mistake, people noticed. A glance held too long, a laugh shared too loudly, and the whole village whispered about it the next day. And then there was the church. For better or worse, it was the beating heart of medieval communities. Courtship often unfolded under the eyes of priests and parishioners alike. Young men would linger after Mass, hoping to walk a girl home. Parents kept sharp watch because a daughter's virtue was tied to family honor. Yet even under such scrutiny, love found cracks to slip through. A note tucked into a prayer book, a whispered promise in the shadow of the chapel. But here's something surprising. Not every medieval marriage was arranged. Especially in the later Middle Ages, more and more peasants chose their partners. Did parents have opinions? Absolutely. Did communities sometimes pressure? Of course. But often, if two young people insisted on each other and neither family could prove a major obstacle, the match went ahead. And when they did, it was usually for love, or at least the closest thing to it within the rough and tumble life of the fields. Yet the stakes were high. Premarital intimacy could ruin reputations and futures. Records survive of couples hauled before church courts, accused of improper behavior. Some confess they had plighted their troth in private, basically a secret promise of marriage, and then acted as if it were already official. To the church, that was dangerous because it blurred the line between holy union and scandal. Still, the pull of love was strong. Think about two teenagers both working the harvest, sweat on their brows, laughter on their lips. They don't have silk gowns or jeweled rings. What they have is stolen time in the barn or by the riverbank, or while gathering firewood in the forest. To them, those moments were worth the risk, because in a world where hunger and disease loomed large, love felt like a rebellion, a way to carve joy out of hardship. And there were folk traditions, too. In some regions, young people would test each other with riddles, songs, or games. In others, girls would weave garlands of flowers, leaving them where a boy could find them as a sign of interest. Sometimes, communities even organized bundling, where a courting couple would spend the night together in the same bed, fully clothed under strict rules. Sounds odd today, but for them, it was a way to balance curiosity with caution. But make no mistake, these weren't fairy tales. A broken promise could leave a woman ruined, a child born out of wedlock branded for life. Love could lift, but it could also destroy. And yet, even knowing the risks, people sought it, because life was too harsh not to. So when we think of medieval dating, we have to picture both sides. The joy of fairs and festivals and the fear of judgment and disgrace. It was a world where a smile could change your future, but also where every step was watched, weighed, and whispered about. And maybe that's the most relatable part of all. Because hasn't dating always carried that same thrill and danger? The hope of connection against the risk of rejection. The desire to be seen, to be chosen, to be loved, even when the world warns you not to. If festivals and barns were the stage for village love, the cloisters and monasteries were where desire became dangerous. Here, love wasn't just risky, it was forbidden. Picture a young monk, cloaked in rough wool, rising before dawn to chant prayers in the echoing chapel. His life was supposed to be devoted wholly to God. Yet somewhere between the Psalms and the silence, he glances across the courtyard and sees a pair of eyes he cannot forget. Maybe it's a novice nun from the convent across the way. Maybe it's a pilgrim who lingered too long. Whatever the case, that glance could ignite something he has vowed to extinguish forever. And this wasn't rare. Medieval chronicles are filled with scandals of monks, priests, even abbots caught in affairs. Some monasteries became notorious for secret liaisons. The church thundered against it, but human nature doesn't vanish just because rules are written. For nuns, the stakes were even higher. A convent was both a sanctuary and a prison. Many young women didn't choose that life. They were placed there by families who couldn't afford a dowry or who needed to secure piety in the family name. Imagine being 16, veiled and vowed, yet still longing for a touch, a laugh, a moment of intimacy. For some, the walls of the convent couldn't contain that longing. Letters were smuggled, midnight meetings arranged, even tunnels dug. There are records of nuns exchanging love poetry with knights, of priests fathering children in secret, of entire convents accused of living more like noble courts than holy retreats. And while the church punished harshly when these affairs were exposed, many were hidden by communities who turned a blind eye. Because, at the end of the day, people understood. Love doesn't always obey the rules. But not all forbidden love happened inside the cloister. Sometimes it was simply a matter of class. A noblewoman might fall for her squire. A knight might pine for a peasant girl he could never marry. The rules of rank were iron bars just as strong as monastery walls. And yet people tried. There are ballads of star-crossed lovers meeting in secret gardens, of husbands discovering betrayal, of duels fought over whispered promises. And then there was the sharpest edge of all, love that crossed religious lines. In medieval Spain, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities often lived side by side. But intermarriage, that could spark outrage, exile, even violence. And yet history preserves tales of it happening, hidden in poetry, in court cases, in rumors that refuse to die. These forbidden loves remind us of something timeless. The heart rarely listens to reason. In a world where honor, class, and religion dictated everything, to follow your feelings was an act of defiance. Sometimes it led to ruin, sometimes to martyrdom, and sometimes, just sometimes, to stories so powerful they lived on in song and legend. So when we think of medieval dating, we can't just picture the church dances or the family feasts. We also have to imagine the shadows, the stolen kisses in cloisters, the letters that could cost a life, the love that burned brightest precisely because it was forbidden. And maybe that's why these stories still grip us today. Because whether in a monastery, a castle, or a tiny village, the truth remains the same. The more love is denied, the more fiercely it demands to exist. If forbidden glances in monasteries showed us the risks of love, then songs in the courtyard showed us its celebration. Because in the medieval world, music wasn't just entertainment. It was one of the sharpest tools of romance. Picture a troubadour under a balcony, lute in hand, strumming under the moonlight. It sounds cliché now, but in the 12th and 13th centuries, it was revolutionary. These poet-musicians traveled from castle to castle, singing not of war or kings, but of desire, of the ache in the chest when love was out of reach, of the trembling joy when love was returned. They gave language to feelings many had no words for, and these weren't just songs of flirtation. Troubadours shaped an entire culture of courtly love, a philosophy that turned romance into an art form. Love, they said, should make you noble, courageous, better than you were. To love was to suffer, yes, but it was also to elevate your soul. That's why knights pledged themselves to ladies in impossible devotion, and why young women swooned at words that seemed to promise eternity. But it wasn't just the nobility who lived in this world of music. In villages, minstrels played fiddles at weddings and fairs, their ballads teaching lessons through story. Some were comical, mocking jealous husbands or clumsy suitors. Others were tragic, telling of lovers who died because society kept them apart. These songs spread faster than any book, carried by memory from town to town. Poetry, too, was a form of courtship. Imagine receiving a hand-copied verse, inked carefully on parchment, sealed with wax. For the literate elite, words were as intimate as touch. In Spain, love poetry blossomed across Christian, Muslim, and Jewish traditions, sometimes blending languages in a single verse. In Persia and Andalusia, metaphors of gardens, wine, and nightingales crossed borders, weaving a shared language of passion. And let's not forget art. Illuminated manuscripts sometimes hid little drawings of lovers kissing in the margins, placed there by cheeky scribes. Tapestries depicted courtly scenes of knights kneeling before ladies. Even stained glass windows in cathedrals, though commissioned to glorify the divine, occasionally slipped in human gestures of tenderness that no one could quite explain. But perhaps the most powerful thing about medieval love songs and poems is how they preserved the inner world of people long gone. We know kings conquered and armies clashed because the chronicles tell us. But to know that a shepherd boy sang of missing his beloved while watching the stars, or that a noblewoman compared her desire to a hawk yearning for flight, that tells us something deeper. It tells us that, across centuries, the language of longing is the same. Think about it. Haven't you ever heard a song that made you feel like someone had reached across time and put your feelings into words? That's exactly what music did in the Middle Ages. It made love feel not just personal, but universal. So if dating in the medieval world was bound by family, class, and church, then music and poetry were the keys that could unlock those chains, even if only for a moment. They let people dream. They let people imagine love as something pure, transformative, even divine. And maybe that's why so many troubadour songs end not with union but with yearning. Because sometimes the chase, the ache, the distance, that was the love itself. Now, let's pull back the curtain a little. Because while troubadours sang of passion and shepherds whispered promises under the stars, most medieval relationships weren't decided by heart at all. They were decided by family. Marriage in the Middle Ages was rarely about two people falling in love. It was about alliances, land, and power. To marry was to stitch two households together, to secure peace between rival lords, or to expand property holdings. The church sanctified it, but the ledger books often dictated it. Imagine being a young noblewoman, barely 15, and told that tomorrow you'll be wed to a man twice your age. You've never spoken more than a sentence to him. Maybe you've never seen him at all. Yet your family insists this is for your honor, for your lineage, for God's will. And so you walk down an aisle not as a bride filled with giddy anticipation, but as a bargaining chip in a political game centuries old. But here's the thing. Arranged marriages weren't limited to kings and queens. Even among peasants, family approval carried enormous weight. A father's blessing could mean access to a dowry, livestock, or land rights. Without it, two young lovers had little chance. In fact, some villages had public rituals where couples had to announce their intentions before the community, almost like holding a hearing. If parents or neighbors objected, the match could collapse on the spot. And yet, even in these marriages of duty, affection sometimes bloomed. There are stories of couples who began as strangers and ended as companions, growing into love over shared struggles, harvests, and children. For others, the lack of choice bred frustration, secret affairs, and longing glances toward someone else across the marketplace. The church tried to balance these forces, insisting that consent mattered. By the late Middle Ages, canon law recognized that a marriage was only valid if both bride and groom agreed, even if pressured. But in practice, consent was murky. A nod under a parent's stern gaze was enough to seal a union. Dowries played a massive role too. A bride's family was expected to provide money, goods, or land as part of the marriage contract. For poor families, scraping together a dowry could mean years of sacrifice. For wealthy ones, it was an opportunity to flaunt status. Imagine a wedding chest brimming with linens, silver, or even entire villages passed from one lord to another as part of a union. And let's not forget the darker side. Some marriages were cages. Women in particular could find themselves bound to men who controlled not just their property, but their bodies, their choices, their futures. Escaping an unhappy marriage was nearly impossible. Divorce forbidden by the church, annulment rare and costly. Affairs were dangerous, punishable by scandal or worse. Yet, amid all of this, the human heart refused to be fully caged. We find court records of secret promises exchanged, of elopements in defiance of parents, of couples who dared to marry in secret chapels or fields, trusting love more than law. Some were caught, punished, or forced apart. Others managed to slip beneath the radar, carving out a small victory for the heart in a world ruled by duty. So while dating in medieval times might conjure images of roses and lutes, the truth is often harsher. Most marriages were contracts, negotiations signed in flesh and parchment. But even here, in the most rigid of systems, love found cracks to grow through. Like a flower pushing through stone, it refused to vanish. Because no matter how much society tried to control it, no matter how many parents signed papers or priests read vows, the heart still whispered, still wandered, still searched for its own rhythm. If you were lucky enough to reach your wedding day in the Middle Ages, the whole thing would feel like stepping into a play where every gesture, every word carried weight. Weddings weren't just private promises. They were public events, binding not just two people but entire families, villages, and sometimes kingdoms. Picture it: banners flying from the manor, bells echoing across the countryside, villagers gathering in their rough wool tunics while nobles shimmered in silks and furs. A medieval wedding was part legal contract, part religious rite, part carnival. The ceremony itself often took place right outside the church doors. Before the couple even stepped inside, they exchanged vows in front of witnesses, because marriage was as much about law and community as it was about God. Only after this handfasting did they enter the church for a blessing. The priest would sprinkle holy water, chant prayers, and bind their right hands together with a strip of cloth, the origin of the phrase tying the knot. And then came the kiss, not the soft, romantic kind we imagine today, but a sealing of the contract in full view of the crowd. Sometimes, the cheers that followed were less about passion and more about relief that everything had gone smoothly. But once the vows were made, the real show began. The wedding feast was the heart of the celebration. Tables groaned under roasted boars, spiced pies, and trenchers piled with bread. Wine and ale flowed freely, music filled the air, and jongleurs, medieval entertainers, performed tricks or bawdy songs. If you've ever wondered what a medieval bachelor party felt like, some of those songs probably came close. The bride and groom were often expected to sit at the high table, elevated for all to see, like two monarchs presiding over their own little kingdom. Guests toasted them endlessly. sometimes slipping in jokes that tested how much innuendo the priest could tolerate. And then there was the bedding ceremony, a tradition that sounds shocking to us now. In many households, the newlyweds were escorted to their chamber not in private, but with half the village trailing behind, singing and laughing, sometimes even tossing the couple onto the bed. In noble circles, important witnesses might stay in the room until the curtains were drawn to ensure the marriage was consummated and therefore legitimate. Can you imagine the pressure of that moment? Of course, not every wedding was a grand spectacle. For peasants, the feast might be little more than bread, cheese, and watered ale, shared with family and neighbors. But even then, music and dancing made the day feel special. A borrowed garland of flowers, a small gift of coins, even a roasted chicken could transform a humble gathering into a memory. Symbols surrounded the event, too. Brides wore wreaths of herbs like rosemary for remembrance or ivy for fidelity. In some regions, breaking a loaf of bread over the bride's head was believed to bring fertility. Rings, when used, were simple bands of metal, yet even these carried the weight of eternity. And through it all, the wedding day carried a strange duality, joy and dread, celebration and duty. For some, it was the happiest day of their lives, the start of a partnership that grew into love. For others, it was the closing of a door, the end of freedom, the first step into a life chosen not by them but for them. But one thing is certain, medieval weddings were never dull. They blended spectacle with solemnity, laughter with law, feasting with faith. They reminded everyone watching that marriage wasn't just about two hearts. It was about the entire world built around them. Now, let's step into the shadows of medieval love, the place where devotion met desperation, and where people whispered to saints one day and to sorcerers the next. Because love in the Middle Ages wasn't just about arranged marriages and family alliances. People longed, they yearned, and sometimes they schemed. Imagine being a young woman in a small village, promised to a man twice your age because your father owed him a debt. What if your heart already belonged to someone else? What could you do? In a world without dating apps, without secret road trips, people turned to charms, potions, and whispered rituals. Love charms were everywhere. A common one was the simple nod. A woman might take a strip of cloth from her beloved's clothing, tie it into 3 knots, and recite a prayer while imagining his face. Some even buried these knots under doorways, believing that each time the man walked over it, his heart would be drawn closer. Herbs played a starring role too. Rosemary for remembrance, basil for attraction, and rue for protection. In Italy, women were known to tuck sprigs of basil into their hair, sending a silent signal to suitors. In France, lovers exchanged sprigs of rosemary wrapped in ribbon. And in England, girls floated apple peels in bowls of water, hoping the letters they formed would spell out the name of a future husband. But sometimes, charms grew darker. In medieval manuscripts, we find recipes for love potions that sound more like witchcraft than romance. Wine infused with mandrake root, honey laced with ground pearls, even powdered animal hearts. Some formulas instructed women to slip a drop of their own blood into a man's drink, believing it would bind him forever. Can you imagine the risk and the fear in trying something like that? Of course, the church condemned these practices, warning that such magic was sinful, even dangerous. Yet confessional records show that plenty of people, rich and poor alike, admitted to trying them. When love is forbidden or impossible, people will always look for a way around the rules. One story tells of a knight who carried a small gold amulet, said to contain a piece of parchment with sacred words. He believed it made women fall for him wherever he traveled. Another tells of a woman accused of witchcraft because she kept a vial of love water, a mixture of herbs and holy oil, under her pillow. And let's not forget the songs of troubadours, wandering poets who spread tales of impossible love. Their verses often describe the pain of longing, the sweetness of stolen glances, the torment of desire unfulfilled. But behind the poetry, there were real people, listening in candlelit halls, hoping these words might mirror their own secret hearts. What fascinates us today is how love in the Middle Ages balanced on a knife's edge between faith and magic. A prayer to Saint Valentine might be said in the morning, but a love charm whispered at night. Both carried the same hope, that the one you longed for might long for you in return. Because whether peasant or noble, knight or maiden, everyone feared the same thing: to love and not be loved back. And so they turned to whatever tools they could grasp: prayers, herbs, charms, or a carefully tied knot hidden beneath a pillow. Let's talk about the forbidden. Because while medieval songs and stories loved to paint love as pure and holy, real life was far more complicated. People cheated, people lied. People risked everything for stolen kisses and secret rendezvous. And when they got caught, the consequences could be brutal. In most villages, marriages weren't built on romance. They were contracts, alliances, bargains sealed for land, wealth, or peace between families. But the human heart doesn't always follow parchment and ink. Imagine a young wife married off at 15 to a man she barely knew. A year later, she finds herself drawn to a shepherd who sings by the river. What happens when longing outweighs fear? Adultery was considered both a sin and a crime. For women, the punishment could be devastating. In some towns, adulterous wives were paraded through the streets wearing only their underclothes, forced to endure the jeers of neighbors. In harsher cases, they were whipped, their hair shaved, or even branded with hot irons. Men often faced lighter punishment, maybe a fine or a few days in the stocks. The double standard was clear and it burned. Yet despite the risks, affairs flourished. Why? Because passion is stubborn. Knights, bound to ideals of chivalry, often found themselves entangled with married noblewomen. Their romances became legends. Think of Lancelot and Queen Guinevere. Their love both intoxicating and destructive. Troubadours sang of such romances, weaving tales that thrilled listeners, even as the church thundered warnings from the pulpit. Sometimes, love triangles ended in blood. Chronicles tell of jealous husbands challenging rivals to duels, or of lovers caught and executed together. Their bodies hung side by side as a warning. Other times, stories slipped into rumor. The miller's wife who met her lover in the barn, the merchant's daughter who sneaked out under moonlight. These whispers fueled gossip that could ruin reputations as surely as any public trial. What makes these stories so powerful isn't just the scandal, it's the humanity. Because beneath the strict codes, the sermons, the punishments, medieval people were still people. They craved closeness, warmth, the spark of desire. And sometimes they were willing to risk their names, their safety, even their lives, just to feel wanted. It's easy to judge from a distance, but put yourself in their shoes. Imagine living in a world where your future is chosen for you, where your spouse is picked like a business deal, where love is rarely part of the bargain. Would you resist temptation? Or would you sneak one night into the orchard, hoping no one saw? The truth is, medieval adultery was both feared and inevitable. The church railed against it, the courts punished it, but the human heart kept breaking the rules. And maybe that's why we still find these tales so captivating. They remind us that love, even dangerous, forbidden love, has always had the power to defy the world around it. Hey guys, let's pull back the curtain a little. Because if you thought marriage in the Middle Ages was about two people holding hands and promising love forever, you'd be only partly right. For most nobles, marriage wasn't just about hearts. It was about thrones, land, armies, and alliances. It was politics with a veil of romance. Picture a king staring at a map spread across his war table. He doesn't see kingdoms. He sees potential matches. If my daughter marries the duke's son, that secures the northern border. If my son marries the French princess, that opens a trade route. If my cousin weds into Spain, we gain allies against the Moors. In this world, a wedding ring was as sharp as a sword, as valuable as a treaty. For noble women, this could feel like being moved across a chessboard. A girl of 12 or 13 might suddenly be betrothed to a man twice her age, a stranger in another country, someone she wouldn't meet until the wedding day. Love wasn't part of the bargain. Duty was. And with that duty came the weight of expectation. Bear heirs, secure the dynasty, and keep the peace. Some queens turned this into power. Eleanor of Aquitaine is a shining example. Married first to the King of France, then to the King of England, she used her marriages not just to cement alliances, but to shape politics across Europe. She wasn't just a bride, she was a strategist, turning courtly love into a tool of influence, making poets sing of her charm while quietly directing the future of two kingdoms. But for others, the burden was suffocating. Imagine being shipped away from your homeland, leaving your family forever, expected to adapt to a new court, a new language, even a new faith. The loneliness could be crushing. Letters from noble brides often speak of longing for home, of feeling like pawns in a game too vast to understand. And the stakes weren't just emotional. Whole wars could hinge on a marriage pact. The 100 Years' War between England and France. It began, in part, with disputes over succession through royal marriages. A single wedding could redraw borders, topple dynasties, or spark bloodshed that lasted generations. Meanwhile, peasants watched all of this from a distance, sometimes in awe, sometimes in disgust. Their own marriages might be decided by families or lords, but at least they weren't bound by the weight of empires. For them, love could sometimes sneak in. For nobles, the higher the status, the less room there was for affection. So, when we hear medieval ballads of knights swearing love to ladies or stories of queens finding secret lovers, part of what makes them powerful is this contrast. The public face of marriage was political, but behind closed doors, the heart still yearned. And that yearning sometimes cracked through the armor of duty. Marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't just a family matter. It was a battlefield. The altar wasn't just a sacred place. It was also a throne room, a war table, a negotiation chamber. And every bride and groom knew, when they said, "I do," they weren't just pledging themselves to each other. They were pledging themselves to the ambitions of everyone watching. Let's step inside the world of medieval weddings. If you've ever been to a modern wedding with flowers, music, and vows, you might think you'd recognize the scene. But trust me, a medieval wedding was both familiar and wildly different. Let's start with the proposal, or rather the negotiation. For nobles, there wasn't much of a "will you marry me?" whispered under the stars. Instead, there were meetings, scrolls, wax seals, and bargaining tables. Fathers and lords would argue over dowries, gold, land, cattle, or political favors. Sometimes it took months to hammer out a deal. The bride and groom, they were often silent spectators to their own future. But once an agreement was made, a betrothal ceremony sealed the promise. This could happen months or even years before the wedding. In front of witnesses, the couple might exchange symbolic gifts, a coin, a clasped hand, or most famously, a ring. That's right, the tradition of wedding rings stretches back to the Middle Ages. Rings were usually simple bands of gold, sometimes engraved with phrases like Amor vincit omnia, love conquers all. For nobles, the ring was proof of the contract. For commoners, it was a sign of devotion. Now picture the wedding day itself. For peasants, it might be a modest affair in a village church, with neighbors crowding the doorway and the smell of bread baking in the background. For nobles, it was a spectacle. Picture a cathedral filled with incense, stained glass blazing with color, choirs echoing up to vaulted ceilings. The bride, dressed not in white, that tradition came much later, but in her richest gown, often crimson or deep blue, embroidered with gold thread. Her veil might be trimmed with pearls if her family could afford it. The groom, in a doublet and hose, might wear a sword at his hip, a reminder that even in love, power mattered. The vows themselves were surprisingly practical. In many places, all it took was for the couple to stand before witnesses, join right hands, and declare their intent. Priests blessed the union, but in the early Middle Ages, a marriage could be valid without a priest at all, just mutual consent and consummation. Later, the church tightened control, demanding ceremonies at the altar under the eyes of God. And then came the feast. This was where medieval weddings came alive. Imagine long trestle tables groaning under the weight of roasted boars, spiced wine, pies stuffed with venison or fish, and loaves of bread carved with symbols of fertility. There was music, fiddles, lutes, drums, and dancing that could go on for days. Nobles might hire jesters, acrobats, even trained bears to entertain guests. For peasants, the feast might just be stew and ale, but it was still a chance to forget hardship and celebrate. But here's where it gets a little awkward. In many noble households, the consummation of the marriage wasn't entirely private. Guests might escort the couple to their chamber, throw shoes at the door for good luck, or even wait outside until proof of the union was announced. Imagine the pressure of that moment. For nobles, heirs were too important to leave to chance. And yet, despite the formality, despite the politics, weddings could still be deeply personal. Chronicles tell us of brides who wept with joy, of grooms who lifted veils trembling with genuine affection, of moments where duty and love briefly aligned. Because underneath the spectacle and the ceremony, these were still two people, standing before their community, stepping into a new life together. So whether it was a peasant couple exchanging vows under a tree, or a royal bride walking down the aisle of Notre Dame, medieval weddings were more than ceremonies. They were declarations of love, of duty, of ambition, of hope. They stitched together not just families, but entire worlds. So we've just walked out of the medieval wedding feast, the music fading, the candles burning low. But what happened the next morning, when the bride and groom woke up as husband and wife? That's where the real story begins. For peasants, married life was simple, though never easy. A wife might rise at dawn to tend the hearth, bake bread, fetch water, and care for children. A husband would work the fields, mend tools, or tend animals. Marriage was not just romance, it was survival. Every pair of hands counted. A good marriage meant two people who could share the backbreaking labor of keeping a family alive. And yet, there are whispers in records of laughter in smoky kitchens, of shared mugs of ale of couples who grew old side by side, bound by more than duty. For nobles, the picture was grander and heavier with expectation. A noblewoman might find her new life measured not in chores but in heirs. Her body became the battleground for dynasties. A successful wife was one who produced sons, and quickly. Pressure was immense. If months or years passed without children, rumors of curses, infertility, or God's displeasure would swirl. Some women turned to charms, prayers, even potions brewed by midwives to boost fertility. For men, proving virility was just as critical. Chronicles tell of kings boasting of their vigor, while enemies whispered accusations of impotence to weaken reputations. And then there was the matter of intimacy itself. The church kept a tight grip on what was allowed. Believe it or not, there were entire manuals dictating which nights were safe for intimacy and which were sinful. Avoid Sundays, holy days, and certain seasons. Some believed too much passion could endanger the soul. But human nature being what it is, couples often quietly bent the rules. Behind closed doors, medieval marriages were as tender, awkward, fiery, or complicated as any today. Love, however, was not guaranteed. Many marriages, especially among the upper classes, were arranged alliances. A young girl of 14 might be wed to a man twice her age. Affection could grow, but sometimes it didn't. That's when people looked elsewhere. Troubadour songs tell of knights wooing ladies in secret, of noblewomen writing letters to lovers while their husbands rode off to war. Adultery was dangerous, punishable by exile or worse, but the heart has always been reckless. Still, not all was grim duty or forbidden longing. For many, marriage offered companionship in a harsh world. There are legal records of husbands defending wives in court, of widowers who never remarried because none could match her kindness, of wives who managed estates with skill while husbands fought abroad. In small cottages or stone castles, trust and respect could grow, weaving bonds that lasted decades. And children, of course, changed everything. A medieval household, whether peasant or noble, often filled quickly with little ones. Infant mortality was heartbreakingly common, but each child was still a miracle, a continuation of the family's fragile thread. Mothers risked their lives with every birth. Fathers often stood powerless, praying for both mother and child to survive. And when they did, the whole village might celebrate. So, while medieval love stories often sound like they belonged to poets and bards, real married life was a mix of sweat, laughter, prayers, fears, and endurance. Some couples found joy, others only duty, but all of them carried the same quiet hope, that together they could carve out a life in a world that was never gentle. Hey guys, so let's step behind the curtains for a moment, away from the bright feast halls and village greens. What about the love stories people weren't supposed to tell? What about the glances stolen across a churchyard or the quiet rendezvous under moonlight? That's where things get complicated. In medieval villages, everyone knew everyone. Privacy was nearly impossible. Houses were one-room cottages, families slept side by side, neighbors gossiped constantly. So how could a secret love affair even exist? And yet they did. There are church court records full of accusations. A miller caught with another man's wife in the granary. A plowman and a serving girl found meeting in the woods. Sometimes the whole village knew but pretended not to until scandal became too loud to ignore. The risks were enormous. Adultery wasn't just frowned upon. It could mean heavy fines, public shaming, or even exile from the community. For women, the consequences were harsher. A noblewoman caught betraying her husband might face imprisonment in a convent for life. A peasant woman risked not just her reputation but survival, as her husband could cast her out and leave her destitute. And yet, forbidden love continued to bloom, as stubborn as wildflowers growing through cracks in stone. For nobles and royals, secret romances could change history. Think of a leaner of Aquitaine, rumored to have entangled herself in affairs that shook courts across Europe. Or the countless knights who pledged loyalty to their lords, but whispered devotion to their ladies instead. Troubadour poetry from southern France practically glorified adultery, painting it as a noble spiritual form of love, courtly love they called it. The knight adored the lady from afar, often his lord's wife, and though physical union was rarely possible, the longing itself became its own religion of passion. But not all forbidden loves were heterosexual. Medieval Europe, guided heavily by the church, condemned same-sex relationships as sin. Still, hidden in monastic writings and veiled poetry, we find traces of men and women who loved outside the accepted script. Monks writing letters that sound suspiciously tender. Nuns describing visions of union with Christ that blurred into sensual longing. These weren't safe confessions, but they hint at a truth. The human heart rarely obeys doctrine. Sometimes the secrecy wasn't about who you loved, but where you came from. Imagine a noblewoman falling for a stable boy, or a wealthy merchant's daughter running away with a poor apprentice. These stories were often snuffed out by angry fathers, forced marriages, or exile. And yet, ballads from the period are full of them, songs about young couples defying the odds, only to meet tragic ends. They remind us that Romeo and Juliet wasn't entirely Shakespeare's invention. Even the church, for all its strictness, struggled to control desire. Priests themselves often broke their vows of celibacy, keeping mistresses in secret. Records show entire villages sometimes knew which children were sons of the priest, though it was dangerous to speak aloud. The hypocrisy wasn't lost on the people. Love, it seemed, could humble even the holiest. And here's the haunting part. For all the danger, for all the shame and punishment, medieval people still risked everything for love. Isn't that strangely timeless? Whether in a stone castle or a thatched cottage, whether whispered by candlelight or sung by troubadours, the forbidden always carried its own thrill. So when we look at medieval Europe, we don't just see duty and arranged marriages. We see secret meetings at wells, poems tucked into hymnals, and lovers who gambled everything just to feel alive for one stolen moment. Let's talk about gifts. Today, if you like someone, maybe you send a text, buy flowers, or pick up a box of chocolates. But in the Middle Ages, every little object could carry enormous weight. A gift wasn't just a gesture, it was a contract, a secret code, a promise that could change two lives. Knights, for instance, often carried a lady's token into battle. It could be something as simple as a strip of fabric, a ribbon, or even a glove. To us it sounds small, but imagine riding into a clash of swords and arrows with a silk sleeve tied around your arm. That scrap of cloth became more than decoration. It was courage, honor, and devotion bound together. If the knight survived, the token might be returned, kissed, or stitched into a song by a troubadour. Rings, of course, were powerful symbols. Archaeologists have found medieval betrothal rings inscribed with phrases like Amor vincit omnia, love conquers all. But rings weren't just for the wealthy. Even peasants exchanged simple iron bands or braided rushes as tokens of commitment. In fact, the church grew so concerned about young couples secretly marrying themselves by trading rings that it tightened the rules around official ceremonies. Still, those private vows often meant more to the lovers than any priest's blessing. Letters were another treasure, though writing was a privilege of the educated. For nobles, love letters often blended poetry and code. A knight might pen lines full of metaphors, a falcon representing himself, a caged dove his lady, so that even if the letter were discovered, only the two of them knew its true meaning. Some letters were written in Latin, others in French or Italian, depending on the courtly culture. Imagine the thrill of receiving such a note by candlelight, knowing it had traveled hidden in a servant's sleeve or tucked inside a book of Psalms. But not all gifts were written or woven. Music itself was a kind of offering. Troubadours and minstrels made a living singing songs of devotion, sometimes on behalf of those too shy to confess their love directly. Picture a knight hiring a poet to serenade his lady beneath a balcony, the medieval version of a love mixtape. Every lyric carried risk, especially if the lady was already married. Still, those melodies outlasted generations, echoing across time as the roots of modern love songs. Among common folk, gifts were often practical but no less meaningful. A carved wooden spoon, a pair of knitted socks, a sprig of rosemary tucked into bread, all could be love tokens. Even food itself played a role. Apples, for example, symbolized desire. In some villages, a young man would slice an apple in half, eat one piece, and offer the other to the girl he admired. If she ate it, the message was clear. Her heart was open. Animals also entered the language of love. Falcons and hunting dogs were prized among nobles, and gifting one was like giving part of your soul. Among peasants, it might be a lamb or even a chicken exchanged during courtship. These weren't just presents, they were pledges of shared survival in a hard world. And then there was the handkerchief, that delicate square of cloth embroidered with initials or floral patterns. A lady might drop one accidentally for her chosen knight to retrieve, sparking a ritual of chivalric devotion. Later, that same handkerchief might be waved at a tournament, fluttering like a banner of love. But gifts could also betray. A ring discovered in the wrong hands, a ribbon recognized as belonging to another household. These objects could unravel lives, trigger feuds, or even ignite wars. Love in the medieval world was never just personal. It was political, woven into the fabric of alliances, inheritances, and rivalries. Still, whether a ribbon or a ring, a song or a spoon, these tokens tell us something simple and timeless. People in the Middle Ages loved to love, and they found ways to say it even when words were dangerous. Imagine this: you live in a medieval village where most days are work from sunrise to sunset. You tend animals, cut wood, or spin wool. There isn't much time for flirting in the fields. But then, market day arrives. Suddenly, the square fills with noise, color, and possibility. For many young men and women, this was the closest thing to a dating app they would ever get. At the marketplace, stalls overflowed with honey, wool, pottery, and fresh bread. Music played, a fiddler on the corner, maybe a drummer keeping time. And in that crowd, you might catch someone's eye. A smile over a basket of apples, a joke traded while bargaining for spices. These tiny moments were how sparks began. Nobody was swiping right, but everyone was looking, hoping for something to click. Festivals offered even more freedom. Think of May Day with ribbons tied around a tall pole, boys and girls weaving patterns as they danced. It wasn't just fun, it was symbolic. The intertwining ribbons mirrored the intertwining of lives. And for some couples, the dance was the beginning of courtship. A whispered promise made beneath blooming hawthorn trees could carry more weight than a priest's sermon. Harvest festivals were another key moment. After months of hard work, villages celebrated with feasts, music, and contests. Wrestling, archery, or singing competitions let young people show off strength or talent, medieval versions of impressing your crush. Winning a contest wasn't just pride. It was a signal. I can provide, I can protect, I can be chosen. Even in the darkest of seasons, gatherings became opportunities. During Christmas and Twelfth Night celebrations, masks and costumes gave people cover. Hidden identities meant hidden freedoms. A servant could dance with a noble, a widow with a bachelor, all under flickering torchlight. For a few hours, barriers fell away. Some of those encounters stayed playful, but others blossomed into lasting bonds. And don't forget the fairs, giant, bustling events that could last days. Merchants came from distant towns, jugglers and acrobats entertained, and the smell of roasted meat filled the air. For young people, it wasn't just about buying or selling. It was about meeting faces you'd never seen before. Imagine a farm girl from one valley catching sight of a shepherd from another, their hands brushing as they both reach for the same trinket. That chance meeting might grow into letters, visits, and eventually marriage negotiations. Of course, not everyone was free to mingle. Noblewomen were often chaperoned by relatives or servants. Even at festivals, eyes watched, whispers carried. But that didn't kill romance. It just made it more creative. A stolen glance from behind a fan, a flower tucked secretly into a cloak, a song sung loudly in the square but meant for only one listener. The church, interestingly, both encouraged and restricted these gatherings. Priests warned against lustful dancing and unsupervised merriment, but feast days were also sanctioned by religion. Villagers walked a fine line, celebrate enough to honor God, but not so much that you tempted the devil. Yet in practice, everyone knew that fairs and festivals were the heartbeat of young love. Sometimes these events even led to what was called hand fasting, an informal betrothal where a couple would pledge themselves before witnesses without waiting for a priest. It wasn't always legally binding, but in many villages, the community itself enforced those promises. Break them, and you didn't just face heartbreak, you faced shame. Picture it: the flicker of torches around a maypole, the clang of mugs during harvest feasts, the thrill of a mask hiding your face at Christmas. These were the stages where ordinary people wrote their love stories. No castles, no courtly poetry, just laughter, dancing, and the daring hope that maybe this time you'd meet the one. Hey guys, let's step a little deeper into the world of medieval romance. Love wasn't always declared with roses and serenades. Sometimes it was tested through games, riddles, or even trials of skill that might look strange to us today. In village squares, playful games became an excuse to flirt. One popular contest was apple bobbing during harvest festivals. It wasn't just about grabbing fruit with your teeth from a water barrel. It was about showing courage, quickness, and maybe making everyone laugh. A young man who pulled out an apple fast might toss it straight to the girl he admired. If she smiled and took a bite, everyone understood what that meant. Then there were riddles. Words had magic in the Middle Ages, and wit was often prized as much as beauty. Lovers exchanged clever puzzles, short verses, or even rhymed questions. Answer correctly, and you proved not only intelligence but also that you were listening, that you valued the other person's mind. Imagine a girl slipping a riddle into a boy's hand at church, her eyes daring him to solve it before the sermon ended. That was medieval texting. Some games turned more physical. At fairs, men showed off their strength with tug-of-war, log lifting, or even mock sword bouts. But here's the twist: women were often invited to tie a ribbon or scarf around the arm of the competitor they favored. It was a visible token: fight well and do it for me. And when he won, he didn't just earn pride. He earned the right to glance her way, maybe even to speak her name in public. Other times, the challenge was more personal. A suitor might be asked to fetch something rare: a sprig of herbs from a distant meadow, a feather from a hawk, or a seashell from a market far away. These tokens were more than gifts. They were proof. I went beyond my daily life to bring you something beautiful. For girls who lived in a world where choices were limited, such gestures carried enormous weight. Music and dance also played their role. In a circle dance, if a boy dared to break pattern just enough to end up holding a certain girl's hand longer than usual, everyone noticed. The boldness could either embarrass him or seal the beginning of a courtship. Sometimes, during love songs, the singers would insert the names of couples from the village, teasing them gently but pushing the story of romance forward. And then, of course, there were the tests set by families. A father might jokingly challenge a suitor to chop wood faster or prove he could lift a sack of grain. These weren't just jokes, they were coded ways of asking, "Can you keep my daughter safe? Can you provide?" Love in medieval times wasn't free-floating. It always danced with duty. But perhaps the most fascinating tests were emotional ones. In some traditions, couples practiced night courting, where a boy could sit by a girl's bedside and talk through the night, under the watchful ears of parents in the next room. It was a test of restraint, of respect, of patience. Words mattered more than touch. Those who endured hours of quiet conversation often built bonds stronger than stolen kisses ever could. All of these games, riddles, and trials show us something. Medieval love was never passive. It wasn't just about waiting to be chosen. It was about proving through wit, strength, or devotion that your feelings were true. And in a world where marriages often meant alliances and survival, those little tests of love were sometimes the only way to know if a partner's heart was really in it. Let's talk about forbidden love, because in the Middle Ages, it wasn't just frowned upon. It could get you punished, exiled, or even killed. And yet, that danger is what made it burn so brightly in stories and in real life. Imagine being a young knight, sworn to serve his lord, but falling hopelessly in love with the lady of the castle. She's untouchable, married off to seal a political alliance, guarded day and night, her role fixed as a symbol of her family's power. Yet at night, she might slip a note written on parchment, tied to the stem of a rose, and leave it where only he would find it. One glance at a tournament, one secret exchange during Mass, that was enough to set hearts racing. We know these romances happened because troubadour songs and courtly tales are full of them. Some spoke of queens who longed for their champions, or noble women who risked everything for a fleeting kiss. The church condemned it, society shamed it, but the human heart rarely listens to rules. Forbidden love wasn't limited to castles. In villages, a poor boy who dared to love the daughter of a wealthy merchant faced ridicule and rejection. Yet those stories, too, crept into folklore. Sometimes the couple would try to run away, eloping under the cover of night, with nothing but a few coins and the hope of a sympathetic priest who would bless them in secret. And then there were the loves that crossed religious and cultural lines. In medieval Spain, where Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived side by side, romances bloomed in the shadows. A Christian boy falling for a Muslim girl, or a Jewish girl secretly writing poems for a Christian neighbor. These were dangerous bonds. They threatened not only the lover's safety, but the fragile balance of entire communities. Yet the poetry of that era reveals just how often such feelings stirred. The risks were real. Discovery could mean punishment, imprisonment, or worse. Families guarded their daughters not just for virtue, but for honor that determined alliances, property, and survival. For men, forbidden love could mean losing land or titles. For women, the stakes were even higher: shame, exile, or a forced cloistered life in a convent. But here's the truth: people still did it. Because love, especially the kind you're not supposed to have, has a way of feeling inevitable. Maybe it's the thrill of secrecy, the allure of danger, or simply the fact that passion doesn't respect walls and contracts. Stories like Tristan and Isolde, where a knight and an Irish princess are bound by a potion, doomed to love each other against all duty, captivated medieval audiences not because they were fantasy, but because they mirrored real risks people saw around them. And in a way, forbidden love gave people a chance to dream. For peasants whose lives were dictated by survival, for nobles whose marriages were contracts rather than choices, the idea of two souls defying the world for each other was irresistible. It was reckless, it was dangerous, but it was proof that sometimes the human heart stood taller than kings and priests. So, when we talk about dating in medieval times, we can't ignore this truth. Love was often rebellion. To love outside of expectation, to love across lines drawn by society, was the most daring act of all. We've walked through a long journey together tonight, from secret glances in crowded feasts, to love letters hidden beneath wax seals, to the heartbreak of forbidden passion and the triumph of loyalty that defied even kings. What dating was like in medieval times wasn't simple, and it definitely wasn't safe. It was a dance between rules and rebellion, between what society demanded and what the heart whispered late at night. Love could be political, love could be dangerous, but it was never powerless. It shaped songs, carved itself into legends, and gave people, peasants and nobles alike, a reason to dream beyond the walls of their lives. Maybe that's the part that connects us across the centuries. Strip away the armor, the castles, the cloisters, and you'll find something very familiar. The way a glance can say more than words. The way holding someone's hand feels like claiming a whole kingdom. The way love, even when forbidden, makes people feel fully alive. So tonight, as we close this story, I want you to carry that thought with you. Imagine yourself in a medieval courtyard, stars scattered above you, the sound of lutes fading in the distance. Imagine the thrill of secrets kept, the ache of longing, and the quiet truth that love has always been the most daring adventure of all. And now it's time to rest. Let the stories of knights, troubadours, and lovers drift with you into dreams. Because who knows? Maybe tonight in sleep you'll find yourself in a candlelit hall, exchanging a secret smile with someone across the room. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Sleep Sleep well, dream richly, and until next time, good night.